6 years ago, I started off Sim Racing Paddock with a YouTube video talking about my favorite racing simulation at the time, which was rFactor 2. Back then, rFactor 2 was in a very unusual position. Image Space Incorporated, one of the pioneers of the sim racing genre, was facing a title that at the time could be seen as a flop. A questionable business plan, alienating the fans that rallied behind it, and the rise of strong competition led to rFactor 2 being a title that was stuck behind the pack, despite being technically superior in some ways. So what was there to do with the struggling sim? Well, I'm proud to say that 5 years later, rFactor 2 has not only beaten the odds, but it has also established itself as a solid racing simulator in 2021. Note that it's far from perfect and it still has a way to go, but in the past 6 years, rFactor 2 has come from the brink of extinction and has actually continued to grow. So let's take a look at what has happened to rFactor 2 to help give it new life. Before we dive into rFactor 2, I want to dig deeper into the legacy of Image Space Incorporated and what built them into becoming a legendary name in the sim racing world. Image Space Incorporated was formed in 1992, which, fun fact, is actually the year before I was born. Located in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Image Space Incorporated was the second racing simulation company to be founded in a 5-year period, still existing in some form in 2021. The first, Papyrus Design Group, which was founded in Maryland in 1987 and now exists in the form of iRacing. ISI released their first title in 1995 in the form of a vehicular combat game called Zone Raiders for Microsoft DOS and Macintosh. The game was a fairly mediocre title featuring hover cars flying and battling each other, and it was actually published by Virgin Interactive. Yep, that was a thing back in the 90s. After that, Image Space Incorporated decided to make a shift over towards the more realistic racing game front. Their first racing simulation that they developed was Sports Car GT, released for the PC by Electronic Arts, and that little title helped spark something big in the sim racing world. This was the first showing of Image Space Incorporated's proprietary ISI motor engine in a racing simulation application. This would be the same engine to power titles such as EA's F1 series and NASCAR Thunder on Windows. These titles are still fairly solid racing games, made even better by the inclusion of third-party mods. Modding groups such as Risa Studios and Simbin went on to make their own excellent racing simulations utilizing ISI's proprietary engine as a base. Simbin created the critically acclaimed GTR series, which was lauded for having day-to-night transitions and weather in a racing simulation released in 2004. Risa Studios took the ISI Motor 2 engine and created a series cult classic in the form of Game Stock Car, which then evolved into the Automobilista series, one of the greatest sim racing franchises of the 2010s. There's also some dispute as to whether Slightly Mad Studios' Madness engine was derived from the ISI Motor engine, but SMS's history can be traced back to ISI engine-based work. But let's get back on track with ISI and what they were bringing to the table. The last title Image Space Incorporated released in partnership with Electronic Arts was NASCAR Thunder 2004. It was regarded as one of the greatest NASCAR titles at the time, featuring the ability to manage your own NASCAR team and manage each car for different track styles and repair them as you beat them up. While the physics were not up to the fidelity of its competitor NASCAR Racing 2003 season, EA's offering was still a lot of fun. After ISI and Electronic Arts split, the racing game developer decided to go independent and create their own project, an open-ended sim racing title, rFactor. rFactor was designed to be a sim racer's sandbox where you can make just about anything. Lacking the previous resources and financial backing that they got from EA, ISI made a series of sampler cars. ranging from road cars all the way to purpose-built open-wheel racers. You can modify and customize cars with the currency you earned by winning races and championships, but ultimately, that concept of the game didn't matter as much. A single cheat code would give you near limitless money so that you could purchase nearly anything you wanted. Where rFactor shined was with the third-party community. ImageSpace Incorporated provided developer tools right off the bat and said, "Have at it, boys." What we got was the single greatest display of sim racing community development that we may have yet to see. We got everything, ranging from meticulous recreations of Formula 1 teams from off years to giant freaking toilets. We even had a monster truck mod where you could drive in stadiums and take flying leaps through the air. But what I'm getting at is rFactor had nearly any vehicle you could wish for, and the beauty of it was that almost all of them could be downloaded for free. After development finished on rFactor in 2007, that's when mods started to really shine. We had the modding groups such as the Cars and Tracks Development Project, or CTDP for short, MacCore, DRM Revival, and Riza Studios making amazing free content for the simulation. We had third-party Dirt Oval and Rally content that was relatively bare bones, but hey, it was something. Heck, there were even stock car leagues built around rFactor, and they created a full-fledged ARCA racing simulation built off of rFactor's ISI motor engine. While rFactor earned its place in the sim racing limelight, licensing was how ISI kept things afloat behind the scenes. In addition to the wide variety of spin-off titles by former modding groups, we saw professional applications for the simulation software in rather unorthodox ways. The live-action remake of Speed Racer actually used parts of the ISI motor engine to recreate some of the courses in detail for that movie. Now, I gotta say, that's pretty darn awesome. rFactor was a very solid title on its own merits, but it wasn't truly anything revolutionary. The ISI Motor 2 and G Motor 2 engines that ISI developed were solid, but they were already starting to show their age mere months after release. In addition, in rFactor, they got rid of the dynamic weather that was in the previous iteration of the engine used for titles such as Formula 1 Challenge. While rFactor looked decent for its age, it quickly began to look dated as Xbox 360 and PS3 racing titles started coming out, which looked visually superior. Also, after rFactor's release, a new competitor joined the ring from a familiar face in the form of Kunos Simulazioni. Kunos was formed by Italian game developer Stefano Casillo, who was regarded as a wizard when it came to coding a game engine, especially on the physics side. Fun fact though, around 1999, Stefano was actually offered a position at ISI, but unfortunately he had to turn it down due to a logistical issue regarding international labor laws for a game development studio. Their first full release, Netcar Pro, was a very innovative racing simulation that was truly ahead of its time. It had advanced features such as dynamic weather, flat spotting, and even a flight simulator-inspired interior complete with clickable buttons. There was even a mode you could turn on that provided realistic repair and setup adjustment times. Netcar Pro was a revolutionary simulation that ended up as a cult classic. Now keep in mind, this was a simulation released in 2006. rFactor 2 was originally confirmed to be in development all the way back in 2010 and had some truly remarkable features being teased, such as the return of dynamic weather, but also throwing in features such as dynamic tire wear with flat spotting, seemingly inspired by its newer competition. The graphics looked to have received a massive overhaul, featuring some of the most realistic rain effects you could have seen, and they said that this was the evolution of their ISI motor, now being dubbed ISI Motor 2.5. Also, they said they would be adding modding support right off the bat, and they were working with modding studios to create some truly remarkable cars. But after this very exciting tease, we got, well, nothing for quite a while. We would get the occasional tease saying, hey, rFactor 2 is still in development, or we would get a car teased or a modder saying, hey, we're working on an rFactor 2 mod, but we didn't hear anything about the release. In 2012, rFactor 2 was finally released in the form of an early access title complete with a subscription-based online plan. The base game would release for $39, and then it would cost $12 a year for online access, or you could get the complete package for $84, which featured lifetime online racing access. If you haven't gathered already, this was a monetization plan not unlike what was used in iRacing, which featured a subscription-based online system as well, but also required racers to pay for each car and circuit a la carte. ISI's idea was to undercut the competition and provide a more technologically advanced simulation as well. On release, rFactor 2 quickly established that it was the technologically more advanced simulation, more so than anything else we had seen on the market at the time. We got the dynamic visual tire wear, weather, time of day, we got some unorthodox cars, covering a variety of what's available to be raced, and even got some decent early mods. However, the simulation was plagued by weird decisions. Announcing a subscription-based system seems like a smart idea on paper, but that business model only works if you provide content on a regular basis. rFactor 2, off the bat, featured a rather anemic roster of cars and tracks, and missed out on some vehicles that were featured in the original title. Features such as dirt racing, oval racing, and even the championship tool were cut out in favor of the more advanced simulation. It seems like rFactor 2 was hoping to rely on a modding community like rFactor 1 had. The higher fidelity physics engine for rFactor 2 ended up serving as a double-edged sword. The title was more advanced, so it required more time and effort to develop for. While there were a lot of teams that originally planned on making content for rFactor 2, it quickly started leaking out how notoriously difficult rFactor 2 was to mod for. Most commonly, the advanced tire model was described as the biggest culprit, requiring a lot of effort to get right, especially without solid tools and documentation. This time, the modders went to another open-ended modding platform in the form of Assetto Corsa. Remember Kunos? Then their technically advanced yet barren simulator in the form of Netcar Pro? Well, Kunos was learning from their previous experiences as well, and decided to go all in for their next title, Assetto Corsa. This was another hyped title that took years to develop, and was also first released in an early access state. Also, first announced in 2010, Assetto Corsa was promising an advanced simulation with strong developer tools for the community to make awesome third-party content. With Assetto Corsa's early access releasing in 2013 and the official release coming roughly a year later, it was clear that Assetto Corsa became what many had hoped that rFactor 2 would become. It was a DirectX 11 based title, while rFactor 2 was stuck 2 generations behind, still on DirectX 9. Assetto Corsa wasn't as technologically advanced as the rFactor 2, but they had the community rallying behind them, and that spoke in volumes. So in 2015, when I launched my first YouTube video, rFactor 2 was figuratively behind the 8 ball. It was a bleeding edge, yet still dated racing simulation outclassed by its rivals, with dwindling support and promised content locked behind the sim racer's favorite word, coming soon. The future was looking quite dim for ImageSpace Incorporated's latest project. However, there was still a glimmer of hope, and that all came in the form of Marcel Offerman. Now, the thing is, Marcel isn't just some schmuck with a half-decent computer, he has some serious backing power behind him. Marcel was a software engineer at Luminous who somehow had convinced the company to not only create a video game studio, but purchase the assets of rFactor 2 to try to overhaul a deprecated racing simulation. When Luminous took over development of rFactor 2, they decided to try to find a studio name fitting of their plans for the simulation. They settled on Studio 397, with 397 actually being the current lap record for the 24 hours of Le Mans. The studio name perfectly encapsulated what they were wanting to do with rFactor 2. First off, they needed to make great tracks that people wanted to race on. They needed to have marquee circuits such as Le Mans, the Nürburgring, and Sebring. These circuits also needed to be at a high fidelity with a lot of detail. Secondly, rFactor 2 desperately needed better cars. Many of the cars were out of date upon the Sim's release, and other cars, such as the Nissan GT-R Super GT 500 racing car, was teased for years even before rFactor 2's public launch, and then still were nowhere to be seen over 4 years later. Studio 397 needed to bring in great cars and multi-class events. Thirdly, they needed a stable and strong performing solution. rFactor 2 was severely hindered by it being on a 14-year-old rendering engine, as well as featuring hefty system requirements. The simulation needed to be optimized and enhanced to bring it up to the standard of a racing title in the mid-2010s. Finally, it needed to be something that could be marketed to racing series. Sim racing competitors such as iRacing, Race Room Racing Experience, and the upcoming Assetto Corsa Competizione featured officially sanctioned series backing them and would have championships tied in with the real-world counterpart. rFactor 2 needed that extra it factor, and jumping onto esports and real-world racing series could be just that boost it desperately needed. So let's get the question out of the way. Did Studio 397 succeed at reviving the simulation? Well, let's answer that question with some statistics. In January 2015, when I made my original video, there were an average of 83 people playing rFactor 2 at the same time on Steam, with a peak simultaneous count of 199 players. Now jump forward to the end of 2020, and we've been seeing an average simultaneous player count of roughly 600 and peak counts of over 1,000 players. So I'll just say we've seen a noticeable jump in consecutive players. Granted, it's nowhere near the levels of somewhere, say Assetto Corsa or iRacing, but for a title that had some months where the average player counts were in the double digits, getting these player counts now is an impressive feat. While there's still a lot that needs to be done, rFactor 2 is definitely in a far better state than it was 5 years ago. So let's tackle that first question on that list that I made earlier. Has Studio 397 brought in better tracks to improve the racing sim? Back in 2015, it could be argued that the highlight circuit for the sim would have been Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Indy is definitely an iconic circuit, host of the Indianapolis 500, Brickyard 400, and also the US Grand Prix in the past, but it isn't exactly a circuit that can be counted on as a cornerstone title. Besides Indy, there were some generic unlicensed circuits based off of Suzuka and classic versions of Monaco and Spa, but there was no circuit that was like, man, I'm gonna buy rFactor 2 just for that. Now, we have some of the most legendary racetracks in rFactor 2, and some of them are easily the most advanced versions we've had. Studio 397 has embraced laser scanning technology, bringing us laser scan versions of Sebring, Le Mans, and even the Nürburgring. We've definitely had a few quirky additions, such as NOLA Motorsports Park and Botnia Ring and Ibarra, but the more recent tracks have been pretty darn awesome. However, it is worth mentioning that a lot of these new tracks are paid DLC priced at roughly $10 per track. There are DLC packs though where you can get multiple tracks for a discounted price, but at the same time, this is the simulator's best content hidden behind paywalls. But what good are solid tracks if you don't have any quality cars to race with? In 2015, we had maybe a dozen or so quality cars to drive with that I'd say would be worth the investment. The generic unlicensed classic Formula 1 cars were a blast to drive with, and the Formula Renault 3.5 had one of my favorite engine notes at the time. However, there was only one GT3 car, one GT1 car, and a couple offbeat historic and semi-fictional cars, but nothing you could truly market the racing simulation on. ISI had gambled on the community's willingness to make new content for the sim, and unfortunately, it just hadn't paid off. There was even the groundwork laid down for dirt racing with the ISI Interceptor quad bike, but unfortunately, no one from the modding community really picked up on it. Fast forward 5 years, and rFactor 2 now has a much better roster. After finally releasing the Nissan GT-R Super GT 500, Studio 397 decided to hunt down more official content, and they came out swinging. The GT3 roster has been heavily expanded, including vehicles from Porsche, McLaren, and even Aston Martin and Ferrari. In addition, Le Mans prototypes have been added, as well as GTE cars, including the
C8R.
However, like the new tracks, a lot of the best content in terms of cars is also, unfortunately, behind a paywall. Cars are usually $6 a piece, but again, there are bundles you can get multiple cars at a discount. There are still some great vehicles available for free, such as the Road to Indy American Open Wheel cars, the 2018 stock cars, and the historic Formula 1 cars. But it is still rather disappointing that rFactor 2 has so much content now locked behind a fairly pricey paywall. Tackling the third question, is rFactor 2 improving as a simulation on the back end? Well, yes, but also at the same time, kind of no. Don't get me wrong, rFactor 2 is in a much better position when it comes to stability than it was 5 years ago. But at the same time, it can really show its age still. On my top of the line computer, one time it took me over 8 minutes to load a car and track combo, which is ages compared to titles such as Assetto Corsa Competizione, which can load a full race weekend in less than 10 seconds. Also, there have been stability issues in regards to online races, which have actually affected marquee events, but I'll touch on that in a minute. But on the positive side, rFactor 2 has admittedly making some massive leaps in the back end, and it's paid off. Studio 397 upgraded the ISI motor and G motor engine to support DirectX 11 and added in post-processing and virtual reality support. There are still graphical touches and improvements that need to be made, but comparing what we had in 2015 to what we're having in 2021, it's a big difference. Tackling that final question, has rFactor 2 been turned into a marketable title? We've seen that rFactor 2 can at times be the most powerful racing sim on the market, but without the support of marketing, it's not going to grow. But it's interesting to see rFactor 2 growing into a legitimate contender in the esports and real-world racing. Studio 397 isn't throwing in their cars willy-nilly, but they're creating relationships with the companies they're working with. rFactor 2 has been featured by McLaren, Formula E, and was even highlighted by my favorite race car driver Jeff Gordon as he trained to replace an injured Dale Earnhardt Jr. in 2017. However, rFactor 2 has had some major hiccups as well. One of the largest events rFactor 2 ever hosted just took place this past year, and that was the virtual running of the 24-hour of Le Mans. Due to the pandemic, real-world racing was put to a halt and we saw sim racing take the spotlight. iRacing hosted official NASCAR racing events, and rFactor 2 featured the official running of the virtual 24-hour of Le Mans. Now, if you told me in 2015 that rFactor 2 would host a 24-hour race televised in an official partnership with the WEC, I would have said you were crazy. But that happened, and to be frank, it went fairly rough. The race was red flagged twice due to server issues and was criticized by real-world racer Max Verstappen. rFactor 2 had the blessing of a major endorsement, but was also cursed by the dated engine causing issues. The funny thing, something similar happened on a global scale during the Visa Vegas E-Race, where rFactor 2 was painted in a less than flattering light. Some technical glitches led to the fan boost being stuck on the car of race winner Ollie Pakala, resulting in him forfeiting the $200,000 prize. That race utilized a Rush version of the Formula E race car as well as a Las Vegas street circuit, so it made rFactor 2 look far worse than it actually looked at the time. But the funny thing is, that race actually resulted in a massive boost for the racing simulation. In January 2017, rFactor 2 saw a 50% boost in their player base, and that somehow has been sustained for quite a while now. There have been other leaps in player activity at times, but it's pretty apparent that the Visa Vegas E-Race in 2017, while it was pretty detrimental on the screen, was actually a major boost for the sim. 2020 has been the first year rFactor 2 saw a monthly peak player base of over 1,000 every month, and it's great to see the simulation still improving a decade after it was first announced. However, we're in this weird situation now where we're transitioning between yet another gaming generation, and now I'm not truly certain about how rFactor 2 is going to handle that transition. We're going to be seeing massive racing title releases this next year, such as Forza Motorsport and Gran Turismo 7. With these massive releases incoming, there will be another spotlight shined onto the hobby of sim racing. While rFactor 2 could market itself as a great PC sim racing title, there are definitely bits and pieces that need to be drastically improved. This generation, we're seeing an emphasis on load times and the instantaneous experience in an age where we have blazing fast solid-state drives and optimized hardware. A load time longer than a minute for a single car and track? It's definitely a pain where if you load an event and discover you need to fix a graphics setting or something, you'll need to jump back out, fix your settings, and wait another minute or two and get back behind the wheel. It's 2021 now, we're getting more and more impatient in general. Studio 397 needs to see what they can do to reduce their astronomical load times. And then, I hate to say it, they need to overhaul the UI again. They need to overhaul the front end. They need to overhaul the back end. I know they just released this new experience, but again, it's just moving around the buttons. I feel that Studio 397 kind of missed the point of what we were talking about when we were asking for the new UI. We were wanting a snappier UI. We didn't want to play search and find the new function. There are some back-end elements that are great. I love that I can now just have a single executable file and not worry about the single player versus multiplayer mode. I can just jump in, and the competition model has some great potential. But we need to make this user interface snappier and more accessible, and I'm going to talk about that in a later video. But let's get on to this next point. Another thing that needs to be a focus for Studio 397 is less of a reliance on Steam's workshop. One of the weirdest decisions for rFactor 2 is that you would need to download all of the first-party content piecemeal, even if it's free. The idea was that you would only need to download the content you'll drive, and I believe that idea made more sense in 2012 when rFactor 2 was originally developed. In 2012, rFactor 2 wasn't on Steam, and they were looking to treat it similarly to the original rFactor, where the first-party content was almost never utilized and fans would just install their favorite pieces of third-party content. However, now we're in 2021, we have faster and more reliable internet and bigger hard drives, which allow us to download full games in hours. Another problem is that we are rather lazy. Even if a product is free, we'll need to go into Steam Workshop, navigate the fairly convoluted menu system, and then just stumble across that desired piece of content, subscribe, wait for it to download, wait to it to verify in game, and then you can drive with that free piece of content. That creates another layer of difficulty, especially when updates are released. Steam Workshop does make things easier, but again, it can be difficult to find good first-party content in there. What I would love to see is Studio 397 reorganizing their system to a situation where all the free first-party content is included in the base installation, which would lead to a more consistent experience that requires less hunting for content. Then, that would leave Steam Workshop for the third-party content that's available. There is some excellent third-party content available, but when you have to dig through a convoluted menu system that has no distinguishing categories, that turns the mod downloading experience into a pain. Another thing I would love to see is a complete collection option for people looking to buy and download the complete rFactor 2 experience. rFactor 2 has definitely brought in some great cars and tracks, but when you have to buy everything piecemeal, you have to end up paying double or triple the cost of the base game. I think that's going a bit overboard if I say so. Now, I'm not doubting the quality of work that Studio 397 has done, but we are living in an age of high-fidelity racing simulators everywhere, with laser-scanned circuits and detailed cars galore. iRacing and Raceroom's pricing works because they have a steady flow of online events and active support to keep them fresh. rFactor 2, on the other hand, is littered with empty servers with all sorts of content mismatches due to a convoluted file system. The last but definitely not least fix that needs to be done is that we need reasons to race. rFactor 2 could definitely benefit from a championship tool, online competition system, even time trials. Right now, rFactor 2 is an awesome hot lapping simulation, a decent racing single-player sim, and a quite lackluster multiplayer experience. While the behind-the-wheel experience is second to none, we need more ways to get motivated to get behind the wheel and compete with other people. So again, let's tackle this question. Has rFactor 2 improved over where it was in 2015? The answer to that question is simply heck yes. I would much rather play rFactor 2 in 2021 than in 2015 because it's given me cars I want to race and locations I want to race at. They're improving the experience of driving and racing in the simulation, and people have noticed. But there are still a few things that need to be done. Compared to other racing simulations, rFactor 2 is simply starved for content. It needs a better online racing experience. It needs a more stable backend with better optimizations. It also just needs racers. The issue lies in the fact that we are now spoiled when it comes to our choice of racing simulation. Assetto Corsa Competizione, iRacing, Raceroom Racing Experience, and Automobilista 2 are providing more complete racing experiences that could come off as more appetizing for someone looking to just jump into a race. However, if you sift through the niggles and annoyances, you can find a truly remarkable sim racing title that has remarkably beaten the odds and has gone from a simulation on death's door to one that is actually getting easier and easier to recommend. 2021, in my opinion, is going to be the make or break year for Studio 397 and rFactor 2. They just launched their new user interface and the new competition model, and it's receiving pretty middling results. But the thing is, it's now out there. They need to commit. They need to support this, or else the community is going to stop supporting them. But let's look on this flip side. The simple fact that we are still talking about rFactor 2 in 2021, almost 11 years after it was first announced. And we're not talking about it as a has-been. We're not talking about a title that died 5 years ago. We're talking about it as still one of the best racing simulations available, and I just gotta say, that's a major accomplishment in itself. However, I do think we can make it even better as a sim racing community. We are now at a point where rFactor 2 has the content we want, the structure for modding, and one of the best physics models available, albeit with some things that need to be addressed. If Studio 397 can focus on improving the new competition model and new UI, optimizing the backend, and improving these fine little details, then we could see rFactor 2 taking this crown again, not just for physics, but also as a full-fledged racing simulation package. But time will tell, and that is why I'm excited to see where rFactor 2 is going into 2021 and beyond. And yeah, those are my thoughts on rFactor 2 and how it's improved in the last 5 years. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments though. Have you felt that they've made great improvements? Or do you feel like it might be too little too late? Let us know in the comments. Also, if you like this video, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to help keep us on track. For the Sim Racing Paddock, I'm William Marsh, and thanks for watching.